if one of them had challenged the captain and checked with air traffic control, the accident may never have happened.
There's a story in your book that I'm very familiar with, and I was excited to see your explanation, your take on it. And I've studied this particular situation, and it's the worst aviation disaster in history. It's the deadliest accident. There were almost 600 people that died. And anybody that wants to research it is interested in aviation. It's a fascinating story, and it comes for the lack, in my opinion, of clear communications and this ego that we're talking about.
Absolutely.
You have to have clear communications. So why don't you tell the story about what happened?
This happened 29th of March, 1977 at Tenerife airport. Fog descended at the time at this very busy airport. And KLM 747 with the captain by the name of Jacob van Zanten, they were taxied and ready for takeoff to get airborne to go to a neighboring island. Very sadly, a Pan American 747 was still on the runway. They were trying to clear the runway to taxi to their parking slot. But because of the fog, they couldn't be seen. And because of the poor radio communication, that message didn't get through, that it was still on the runway. And so what happened was the KLM aircraft, Captain Jacob van Zanten, they started their takeoff roll and they hit the Pan Am 747 about 3/4 of the way down the runway. And as you say, 583 people lost their lives that day. So what caused that? Now, there was a lengthy investigation, but pick up on some of the points you raised there, Susan. First was communication. Communication, there's two ends to it. There's the transmit and there's the receive.
Exactly.
And this applies in everyday life and business as much as it does on an aeroplane. It's about making sure you transmit a clear message, but also you need to make sure it's being received. And back in 1977, the procedures around the words, the vocabulary that was used for certain instructions was not as clear as it is today. And this is one of the things that came out of that accident. The language used for communication between air traffic control and aircraft was tidied up to make sure that a message was not only transmitted, but it was received and understood at the other end. So in this particular case, the KLM aircraft ready for takeoff, air traffic control transmitted a message, but it didn't get through clearly to the KLM flight deck crew. And there was a belief by that crew that they'd probably been given clearance to take off. So they started the takeoff roll. So that was the first thing, communication. But the other thing which taps into the ego side that you mentioned was Captain Jacob van Zanten of the KLM aircraft. He was the most senior pilot in the airline. He was what's known as a senior training captain. He trained other pilots, but also he was quite literally the poster pilot for KLM. His face appeared on all of their advertising posters everywhere in their flight magazines. He was, the face of the airline. What that meant on the flight deck was that the other two crew members, the first officer and the air engineer, they kind of looked up to him. He was almost God in the company terms. And it was very difficult for them to challenge his view. And so when they were ready for takeoff, the captain, Van Zanten, said, "We're going." He pushed the throttles forward. And the air engineer kind of questioned a little bit, but didn't follow through. And neither did the first officer. So he wasn't challenged around, do we have clearance to take off? And if one of them had challenged the captain and checked with air traffic control, the accident may never have happened.
Exactly.
And this was put down to perhaps the ego of the captain. He knew what he was doing. And what we call the cockpit gradient, and we have this in business as well, i.e. the seniority of someone in the company is so high compared to the junior person who's got a view. The gradient, it's so steep between them that the junior person will not speak up. If Captain Van Zanten had humble confidence and was willing to listen to his crew, again, things may have turned out differently. Now, there is one good thing that came out of that, perhaps two. One was the communication procedures on the radio, but also it led to something which is known as crew resource management, CRM for short. And this was a direct result of the findings from that accident. And since the early 80s, it started with United Airlines, but the early 80s, all professional crew members have been trained in what's called crew resource management, CRM. And this is a culture where the most junior pilot feels empowered to speak up to the most senior pilots. And I was trained in this too. And towards the end of my flying career, I was a very senior guy, both in terms of flying and also the rank I held in the military. And whenever I climbed onto the flight deck of our aircraft, I'd turn to the really junior pilots I often flew with and said, look, your job is to watch me and catch me out. If I make a mistake or say something that you think is incorrect, your job is to speak up. You got it? And I made it very clear that they were empowered to do that. And of course, two things happen. One is, first of all, there's a good chance that you then don't miss things, but also you're empowering that other person. You are lifting them up. You're giving them a voice. And that is hugely powerful.
Yeah, and that only happens if there's open communications and humble confidence.
Absolutely. Yeah, humble confidence. Humble confidence is the thing. Ego needs to be left behind. And there are some other great stories in my book, I think, where things have happened to me, being faced with crash landing an aircraft with 140 people on board, where the captain at the time, I was the first officer, but the captain at the time showed superb humble confidence, which in large part led to the great outcome of that situation.
Yeah, you have great stories. Like, we're not going to have time to go over all of them, but you've just got great stories that support the points that you're making.